My name is Elizabeth Castelny, and it is my great honor to be the CEO for Preservation Virginia, and I want to welcome you here tonight. The first on the agenda is a greeting from the new executive director here at the Black History Museum and Cultural Center. She wasn't able to join us for the program, but Shakia Gillette-Warren started her new position in May. She's already been talking to us about her great plans, and so here's a greeting from her.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Shakia Gillette-Warren, Executive Director of the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia. It certainly would have been my preference to greet you in person and welcome you to our facility. As we are in an era of digital content delivery and interaction, I'm happy to know that my virtual greeting is acceptable, and I look forward to a future date when I'm able to be there with you and share in our beautiful space. With that said, thank you for choosing to visit the BHMBA. Our mission is to provide, develop, and partner in the creation of educational resources, services, and opportunities to promote and advance understanding of history and culture of Black people and African Americans in the Commonwealth. 2021 marked 40 years of doing just that. Through our exhibitions, educational programs, cultural events, and community engagement, BHMBA has served as the primary resource for Virginia's Black history. In 2022, we opened our 40th anniversary exhibition titled Forging Freedom, Justice, and Equality, an extremely timely exhibition which featured 6 themes relevant to the Black experience in Virginia. We also showcased the pop-up exhibit titled Crypto-Federacy, which displayed artifacts and images related to the removal of the Confederate monuments. We are also excited to partner with Jaimin Hansu's Foundation for the annual Run Richmond 1619, which supports Hansu's Africa Reconnect initiative. We are beginning the next 40 years of our journey by taking our assets outside of our 4 walls and meeting the challenge of fulfilling our mission within the confines of our physical footprint by actively seeking opportunities for place-based initiatives to present Black history as a part of our overall shared history, much like the partnership that I mentioned earlier. We are building relationships and partnerships with mission-aligned organizations, so our collaborative efforts will provide greater access to Virginia's Black history that has, in many cases, been critical to our nation's and world's inclusive history. We are in the unique position of having relevant content, artifacts, art, historically significant documents, and images. All of this can be utilized to provide services both within our current facility as well as through virtual and augmented reality activities, portable programming, and a mobile museum, all for the sole purpose of promoting and advancing the understanding of the history and culture of Virginia's Black people. As I mentioned before, we are meeting the challenge of fulfilling our mission within our walls by actively seeking opportunities for place-based initiatives to present Black history as a part of our overall shared history. While working outside of our walls is of paramount importance, we are also focused on creating a world-class experience for our visitors like you to our site. The educational opportunities we will offer to school-age children and youth will be valuable additions to the classroom curriculum. This work will inform how we will make our services accessible to students across the Commonwealth. There is so much more I could share about BHMBA and what lies ahead for us. My hope is that you have been enticed enough through this brief message and inspired to become a member, just in case you're not already a member. If you are a member, take full use of your membership and encourage others to join and participate. With all of that said, I would like to welcome you once again to our site. I hope you enjoy your time at our national treasure, the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ron Hurst. I have the honor to chair the Board of Trustees at Preservation Virginia. We are so glad to have so many people here tonight for this celebratory event. First, before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our 3 African American fellows, Sonia Branch Wilson, Latoya Gray Sparks, and Randall Hazard. And also their mentors for this program, Dr. Lornette Lee, Anna Edwards, and Tim Roberts. And of course, we owe a great debt of thanks to the Black History Museum and their executive director for welcoming us here for this special event tonight. Preservation Virginia's African American Fellows Program was inspired by Brent Leggs, Executive Director of the African American Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. As the keynote speaker at our 2020 African American Historic Sites Symposium, Mr. Leggs spoke about the lack of diversity in historic preservation, a lack of diversity both in the historic places that are preserved and the professionals who undertake that work. He challenged those of us working in Virginia to be a part of the movement to tell a broader and more inclusive story, and more importantly, to create a pipeline for Black professionals entering this field. That challenge stuck in the mind of then Preservation Virginia Chair Genevieve Keller, who together with Elizabeth Castelny, our CEO, organized a Zoom gathering of African American advisors, many of whom have joined us here this evening. Acting as facilitator, Dr. Brian Brown and the rest of the group discussed the necessary components of a Fellows program, the curriculum it would require, and its potential impact. Soon we were on our way toward the program that we're here to discuss this evening. Now, with a generous grant from the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund, Elizabeth and her team needed to find the individual who could lead this program in its first year and who could grow the enthusiasm for the work ahead. And it was our great good fortune to meet Dr. Lisa Wynn Bryan, through Dr. Brown, in fact. Dr. Wynn Bryan has built a career in development and fundraising and is a 2-time graduate of both James Madison University and VCU. She's an overachiever. Lisa joined the Preservation Virginia team as Community Outreach Manager just 1 year ago and has helped to make our goals for the African American Fellows Program a reality. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Wynn Bryan.
Thank you, Ron. I'm really excited to be a part of the Preservation Virginia family. I am grateful for this day. We've worked really hard, they've worked really hard to bring us to this day, and it's just so appropriate that as we celebrate Juneteenth this week, this month, across the city, across Virginia, and across the country, and even the world, even commemorating the Loving versus Virginia case as of yesterday's anniversary for that. So much is happening in Black history in Virginia, and today our fellows will be making history, so we are so excited for them. Each scholar was assigned a mentor during this process, and tonight each mentor will introduce their mentee. The African American Fellowship participants will present in the following order as they are introduced by their mentors. Our first presenter is Sonia Branch Wilson, who will be introduced by her mentor, Dr. Lornette Lee. Dr. Lee is a public historian who teaches, collaborates, and works with diverse community and academic audiences. She has served on the faculty at ODU, VCU, VUU, and the University of Richmond. In 2020, she directed the U of R's Inclusive History Research Project, which investigates slavery, race, and segregation in the institution's history. Our second presenter will be Latoya Gray Sparks. She will be introduced by her mentor, Anna Edwards, the chair of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, a 2004 initiative of the Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. This Richmond, Virginia-based social justice organization grounds its work on the principle of the right of oppressed peoples to self-determination. And our final presenter will be Randall Hazard. Randall will be introduced by his mentor, Tim Roberts. Tim Roberts is a historian, archaeologist, and currently a community point person with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. However, Tim will be venturing out with his own consulting firm, Black Star Cultural Resources, very shortly. So congratulations on that. If time permits, we'll have a very, very short question and answer period following the presentations. We'll take a few questions regard to our scholars here. If you have any questions, we have a few index cards if you'd like to ask a question. We'll have index cards available for you. And so now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Lauren Lee. Dr. Lee.
It is a blessing to share this time together in a day when we don't know what will happen in the next moment. We are indeed blessed. Virginia, with all thy faults, I love thee still. I came across this quote when I was doing research 20-some years ago, and it stuck with me all this time because the way we have been taught history, so much has been left out. And we're very fortunate today that that history is being unearthed. And I am so pleased to be a part of this program. Sonia Branch Wilson is a daughter, wife, mother, sister, passionate veteran educator, family historian, genealogist, podcaster of Threads and Truth, and current president of AMMD Pine Grove Project. All of these roles combined sparked her interest as well as catapulted her pursuit to uncover and preserve Black history and culture. She is especially interested in preserving for posterity the cultural landscape and oral narratives of her family's ancestral home of Cumberland County, Virginia. As a result, family and friends have dubbed her Sony the Collectaholic. Her research project for the African American Fellows Program, Funeral Programs, the biography of a Black community from the 1920s to 1960s. This specific time period was selected to parallel a large portion of time that the historic Pine Grove Tuskegee Rosenwald School was in operation. The catalyst for her research topic is to use information collected from funeral programs as primary sources to enhance the significance of the eligible Pine Grove Rural Historic District nomination. One of her life's purposes has been to connect the threads with the truth by stitching our story and cultural garments together, and has used that to develop her brand, Threads and Truths. Hear ye, Sonia Branch Wilson.
Good afternoon. As Dr. Lauren Lee, or as I call her, Miss Laurinette, because she's just one of my absolute favorite people, Miss has graciously introduced me. I am Sonia Branch Wilson. I am a newbie to this historic preservation field and exhilarated to have been selected as one of the fellows for the Preservation Virginia African American Fellows Program. It is indeed a distinguished honor to be part of this inaugural cohort led by Dr. Lisa Wynn Bryan. Tonight, I dedicate my presentation to Genevieve Miller Baxter, my Aunt Jen, the matriarch of the A.G. Miller Mayo Dungy branch of our family, and she was the eldest surviving alumni of Pine Grove School who departed this life on Sunday, June 4th, and will be funeralized tomorrow morning in Delaware, where we've been all week. I literally got off of the road hours ago to be present for this auspicious occasion. My investment in historic preservation began at a young age. It was environmental serendipity. I was the child who was always curious to know more about our family history through the stories. My grandparents often expressed that we needed to understand where we came from in order to know where we're going. This statement stuck with me, and I began to realize that awareness and connection are the keys to the lesser-known stories of our communities. With each conversation, I gained a greater understanding of who my ancestors were, the struggles they endured, the sacrifices they made, and how they both intentionally and unknowingly left us gems of wisdom, nuggets of information, and breadcrumbs for future generations to follow the paths to their stories. However, when the elders die, so do many of their stories, unless they are recorded. Thus, through my research project, I wanted to construct a biography of a Black community, beginning with my ancestral home, Cumberland County, Virginia, through the use of funeral programs and records from the 1920s to the 1960s. The focus of the research is to examine and extrapolate biographical details from funeral programs and records to make place-specific connections to the surrounding ethnographic, cultural landscapes, and historical sites. Through the use of primary resources to connect people to places within the eligible Pine Grove Rural Historic District in order to revive the voices of those who once lived, worked, worshiped, and were educated in the community. Early in the research, I learned that funeral homes were not going to be as valuable of a resource as I thought. The Marion Gray Thomas funeral records only dated back to 1985. Bland Reed Funeral Home, 1963. And I even checked Jenkins Funeral Home because one of my great uncles moved here and they told me 1973. I further learned that the state of Virginia only requires funeral homes to keep records for 3 years before the establishment can discard the records. Imagine that. Schools have to keep records for 50 years, but funeral homes, 3. This was a gut punch to me. It was hard for me to process, and it was like, what am I going to do? But I pivoted. There was a shift. I went from relying on the funeral homes to churches in the community. The ethnographic landscapes in our PIF was submitted to DHR for nomination as National Park Service recognized the Rural Historic District. Approximately 80 extant historic and or cultural resources were identified and labeled in the PIF, but those resources were static. My project seeks to connect people to the resources on the ground. One of the best ways to do this is through the examination of funeral records, which I had hoped would be found at those 2 Black funeral homes, which I presumed would be valuable repositories for the documents. So I needed to identify the resources on the ethnographic landscape. As a step, I was able to skip because of the thorough research that we conducted for the Pine Grove Rural Historic District preliminary information and approved by DHR in December of 2021. We identified people living in the community during the time period for my research project and finally connected the 2 through the use of funeral programs and records. As I mentioned before, funeral programs and records help to connect people to place and flesh out the important stories. As you will see here, the sources that I used, the Rural Historic District map, which was huge. There was no way I could bring it and display it because it would have taken up the whole front. But it is at Pine Grove School. I relied heavily on church records, oral histories, interviews, the ethnographic resources, the Pine Grove Rural Historic District, and of course the interviews with the elders, the census, and people. Once they learned about the project, I began receiving stats of the funeral programs. Now, the funeral programs are the biographies of lifetime summary of the deceased. It shows the spiritual and cultural traditions that connect the past, the present, providing us with a foundation for learning. In the Black community, these traditions are important to link our history. The research method and design I used and will continue to use is community-engaged, qualitative, and place-based research by searching for surnames of families who live in the Pine Grove Historic District, extracting relative data, query their status, and connect them to place in the Pine Grove school, in the Pine Grove community. So those were my action words that are highlighted: scrub, gather, invite, attach, and tell the story. I also needed other supporting ideas, I needed to show the connection to the community. I needed to connect the different paths that are part of the story. I realized that I needed to conduct longer and deeper research. I want to digitize and archive, make recommendations. This was huge. This was an addendum. Make recommendations for funeral homes to keep records, begin digitizing and serving as repositories, and keep those oral histories. The need to keep those oral histories to accompany the document extractions. So the video is acting a little wonky. I had embedded, but luckily I have Justin G. Reed live and direct. So he's. Oh, you can? Justin, what do you want to do? Video? Okay, let's do the video, he said.
Place-based document that helps reveal some really critical information about Black cultural landscapes. Just from an obituary, you're getting, family histories, across, at least 3 generations, sometimes, 4 or more. You're getting a better sense of these very, interesting and sometimes invisible to the broader public, but in these very interesting kinship ties and networks. You're getting a better sense of the migration patterns that occurred across time for multiple families, and the routes that families often took when they left these southern communities. In our case, Southside Virginia. You're also getting a sense of the sub-communities that exist within the larger community. For example, our funeral homes tend to serve a particular part of the region. If you live in southern Cumberland County, you're typically going to come to Farmville and be serviced by Glen Reed Funeral Home. If you live in northern Cumberland County, you're more likely to attend a church where most members go to Marion Gray Thomas Funeral Home. And so just by looking at the clientele of these funeral homes, you're getting a better sense of their service area, which is actually a cultural landscape in and of itself. And so these are the types of things that Sonia's research has really helped kind of crystallize for me in my mind. And so it's just critical that we do more to preserve and make accessible these rich historical resources. During this fellowship, we've also learned about the challenges that exist, particularly for Black funeral homes that may be interested in this work, like my family. We don't have, any type of data standardization. So, we could very easily doing it one way at Glen Reed. We would also hope that other funeral homes in the community would be documenting and preserving their obituaries in the same way. But we also need that kind of technical support and the financial support, frankly, to be able to do adequate digitization work at our businesses. I think it's also really important to recognize that Black funeral homes do have the potential to serve as community-based repositories and archives for this work. I think so often we want to take historical documents away from their community of origin. Black funeral homes have a very unique role, and a lot of that importance is connected to the trust that's been built over many generations. And so when it comes to being able to serve as a repository, outside of the Black church, there probably is no other institution that's more trusted than a family's chosen funeral home. And so I think there's just really great potential for these particular institutions to serve as this centralized repository for a defined community service area, cultural landscape. And so I want to just thank Sonia for just an incredible job she's done and will continue to do. I'm excited about the next phase of her work. She's really helped our own community see this as a priority, and has really, I think, motivated us to continue to ensure that these histories are more accessible for our kind of broader Great Migration diaspora and for local families as well.
Thank you, Justin. He presented the best argument. Now I'm going to take... Okay.
Can you go to the next slide and I'll get on
that? The implications. There were three. I'm just scratching the surface, as Justin stated, with my research. So there's plenty of work to do, and I'm eager to do it. The retention of records need to be addressed at the state level, because funeral records are indeed historical records. And the value of funeral records to connect to the ethnographic landscape narrative. So I'm going to take you on a quick journey of three brothers, connecting them to the landscape. They happen to be my grandfather, and as a part of my research, I'm developing storyboards for every person who is in the rural historic district. This is how I did my pop-ups first, of course. So, but this is he and two of his brothers. Now, that's Uncle Sam Henry, Uncle Jordan, and Papa. And those are where they were born, the home in which they were born, to my great-grandfather, John William Miller and Susan Ann Mayo Miller, the church that they worshiped, Mount Calvary, and the school that they attended, photo credit, Naya B, for that awesome photo of Pine Grove School. Now you will see here, there's Uncle Sam and his family, the church he pastored, which is also in the Rural Historic District, Bethlehem, and you see his news record, his death notice. He has a very prominent death notice because he pastored for 40 years all over Cumberland, nearby Cumberland, Long Island, Riverhead, Long Island, New York. So then you see their brother, one of their brothers. Uncle Jordan left Cumberland, but he worked at prominent establishments like the Hotel John Marshall. He worked at Lum's. He worked other places in Richmond before he created his own bakery, Miller's Bakery and Cafe, which is in the West End. But do you see his death notice? Very brief, right? And then there's my grandfather, and it showed here how he left Virginia. He migrated to Montclair, New Jersey, where he had his family. He came back. He served as superintendent of the Sunday school at Mount Calvary. And then there's his death notice because we made sure that it was done properly. But what happens? They returned back to the land. Uncle Jordan wanted to be buried in the family cemetery. Uncle Sam wanted to be buried back in the Miller Mayo Cemetery. My grandfather is not there, but most of his 11 siblings are buried back to the land on the home place. So the findings and outcomes, I lack the funeral records at the two funeral homes to support my thesis. It takes longer to digitize even small connections than initially estimated, and there needs to be a large overarching center to design and develop a formal archival searchable database in order to access the collections. So in conclusion, I've developed a few short-term and long-term goals. I want to digitize as many obituaries from 4 churches as possible, organize the obituaries by churches, review the obituaries for additional life accomplishments that can be incorporated into historic district nomination, continue to build my traveling exhibit to encourage community members to share their funeral programs and death notices. The long-term goals: map home places of deceased descendants. We're going to talk, LaToya, the map guru. Develop and share standardized data set for Central Virginia Black funeral home record keeping. Develop a framework for further study and dissemination via educational video, documentary, or searchable database with an accompanying user guide, and publish the biography of a Black community in book form. So while I may not be able to retrieve and digitize all of the important stories and records, my desire is to place as many of them into the historic record as possible through the findings of their programs and death notices, showing their historic presence within the community to preserve for perpetuity. Like Ms. Lornette said, my family has dubbed me Sony the Connectaholic, and the result of being a part of this inaugural cohort of Preservation Virginia's African American Fellows Program, I have begun and will continue to make these relevant connections and stitch together the threads in truth through the use of funeral records and programs for the Pine Grove community. Thank you for your time and opportunity to present a sketch of my research. I leave you with this. I now understand why, culturally, our funeral programs are like gold. And I'm giving each of you a golden nugget as a reminder to sift through your personal stashes, because the information that you gather are treasures. Thank you for your time. That's my husband, the comedian. He said, don't go to Jefferson Loan to try and trade it in. That's from Amazon. It ain't the real thing, okay? Next, we will have Miss Anna Edwards to come forth and introduce the next fellow, LaToya Gray Sparks.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening, LaToya. So, I am really pleased, I was really pleased to be selected to be a mentor to LaToya, though honestly, she didn't need a mentor. LaToya has been a bit of a rising superstar for a few years now, really ever since she created her digital mapping project, which was able to provide for those who got to see it, and I think is an ongoing resource, a map of an early master plan of the city of Richmond, and was able to literally lay out the structural process by which Black communities were destroyed during the urban renewal process of the 1960s and 70s. She just graduated, so you need to give her a round of applause for not only taking, she has a full-time job, she's also an affiliate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University's Department of African American Studies. She took on this fellowship and managed to complete her master's degree, right? Yeah, so just a tired girl over here. One of the reasons I was so pleased to be able to be the person to connect with LaToya was because I had seen her work from afar, and because she embodied a lot of what we hoped would come out of promoting the Shacklebottom Memorial Park, for lack of a better term. That sort of phrase encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses historic preservation of land, of site, of history. But I think one of the pieces is, as we have argued for the creation of this particular place and what it can show us in the civic landscape, is the fact that at the end of the day, what it's supposed to do is be a living cultural resource for the sustenance and the nurturing of the future of the Black community and the community at large by virtue of the fact that the Black community is going to be thriving, because it has this capacity now and this tremendous political will around us to really push these projects forward and make them a visible part of our histories. They're integrated, they're back, they're rewoven. People are understanding their relationship to these histories, even if it's not my history. So for example, LaToya, her project that she's going to talk to you about involves West End of Richmond. And some people know what West End she's talking about, but she will make that clear when she gets up here. I lived in that West End neighborhood from 1997 until 2006. And it's very close to Carytown, and it's full of all these originally 1920s worker houses. And it evolved into a significant part of the Black community, especially as the Black community was growing sort of from the center out. And yet, when I moved in there, the majority of that neighborhood was completely invisible. It was gone. We couldn't see it. I didn't know. I've been discovering little bits and things ever since. And the fact that she took this project on, in part because of the work that she'd already done to map this particular history, which has so dramatically carved up the city in these particular ways, but also because it's her family history. So she has this direct connection to it, these places, these intersections, the buildings that aren't there, the possibilities for what it can mean once we know about it. These things are living in her as she develops this project. So I am extremely proud and pleased to be able to welcome LaToya to this podium so that she can tell you about what she has been doing.
Thank you so much, Anna. This feels so surreal. I remember following your work like decades ago, and in recent time, just being inspired with what you've done and the fight that you've fought when no one else is really doing it to highlight the importance of Black spaces. So being introduced by you is just like a full circle moment. So I'll try not to cry. I'm a crier sometimes. So as I was introduced, I'm LaToya Grace Sparks, and I'm delighted to talk to you somewhat about my project. I'm calling it the West End Memory Project. All preservationists, oh no, I don't want to do that. Sorry. Okay, I'll just do this. So most preservationists, I think, have an origin story, and mine started with a map. This is a redlining map this is an HOLC, so Homeowners Loan Corporation map, but people call it redlining map, of Richmond, Virginia. During the early 20th century, real estate professionals and lenders used these maps to determine the value of land. Blue and green meant high-valued neighborhoods worthy of mortgage loans. Yellow and red indicated low value and blighted neighborhoods. These maps were highly racialized, so red is essentially where Black people lived. I can recall sitting in a room when I was introduced to this particular map and this section of a map, and I was the only person of color in the room, and I can remember the comments on this screen being read aloud. This area in yellow, largely because the school for white children is in the Negro area, D8. And because the Negroes of D8 pass back and forth for access to the William Byrd Park, which lies to the west. For this reason, losses on properties are being taken. I'm in a room with a lot of Black people. I don't know if you have been in that moment where you're like the only Black person in the room and the history of slavery comes up, or the civil rights movements, or just any other historical moment, and you become like the spokesperson for Black people, or the representative taking on all the trauma of Black people. And so hearing these comments read, I just
was in one of those, and this was just a few years ago, I just wanted to melt in my seat and disappear. Because I knew that path that was being described in those comments. I knew the Negroes in that area that were being disparaged by those awful racist remarks. They were my dad, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. And this being the introduction to a space that I grew up in, to people that I came from, it was infuriating to me. And I decided that, as I'm a Luddite when it comes to technology, but I was going to learn how to make my own maps so that I could present a different narrative, because there's something that's just so much bigger and greater than what's being presented here. And so that's how I got started. I started taking some GIS classes, learned how to digitize and make maps, and the rest is history. But coming back to this, so this is representative of the Black West End that I grew up in. And so while I knew about the people and the space, there was a comment about the school in the area, and so that kind of triggered my curiosity. I wanted to know, what school is this, and how come I did not know about it? And so that's what started my journey into doing research into what I call the Black West End. So the primary research questions that I started with were, what school were these remarks referring to? Who were the people that these derogatory remarks referred to? And what did the landscape of the community look like? So I found out that the school being referred to, and I apologize, I did not include that in my slideshow, but if you go to the 2200 block of Idlewood Avenue, you can take a trip over there if you want, there's this granite building. It's very architecturally just beautiful and fascinating. Right now it is Wentworth Manor, so it's a senior living facility. It's been that way for about 20 years or so. Before that, it was the original location of John B. Carey Elementary School, which was a historically white school in the West End of Richmond. During the 1950s and 70s, it would be converted into an all-black school, and that is the West End Elementary School. There are not a lot of documents or records in institutional databases or repositories about the West End Elementary. There's a lot about John B. Carey and the white population that attended the school, but not necessarily about the 20 years in which it was an all-black school. So that just kind of started me going down a rabbit hole just to do more research. And also, and I'll point out that I remember reaching out to some of the major institutions in the area, and none of them had heard, except for one, had heard of West End Elementary. They'd heard of John B. Carey. They had records of the white students who were posing in front of John B. Carey, but not necessarily that middle history, or that history that meant so much and is personal to me. So there's, as my co-worker or cohort said, there's a lot more work and research that needs to be done. So I'm sorry this is a little washed out, but the guiding statements that I used to just keep me going were that the redlining map and those clarifying remarks represented to me the historical and geographical erasure of a Black community. Further, just the reproduction or the perpetuation of the redlining maps just being the only representation of that space, in my opinion, continued this inaccurate and very destructive narrative of a historic Black community that was intact, that was thriving, that was self-sustaining, that was independent, despite all of the chaos of Jim Crow and everything else you could throw at a community. Like, this community was an enclave, as there were several others across the city. And so that's just what I wanted to expose, and that's what guided my research. So the influences that I rely on to do this work includes Black geography, and also digital humanities and digital scholarship and counter mapping. One of my favorite Black geographers is Catherine McKittrick. If you haven't read Demonic Grounds, I highly recommend it. It is, it's gut-wrenching, but it is also just very, very pivotal as far as explaining the relationship between Black people, African Americans, and space and property in this city. McKittrick speaks about the ungeographic nature of Black lives. We have a history of being treated as expendable and transferable. So our history of being initially treated as chattel property, which means if you're into real estate, I once was an agent, you learn that there's chattel property and there's real property. Like, we are still using that word today. So chattel means that it is not affixed to land. It is considered personal property. It can be moved around, manipulated, but it's not as valuable as the property that is affixed to land. So we start with that, being treated as property historically, and then when we get a chance to actually own property, to try to get a piece of that American pie, our property all of a sudden is blighted. It becomes slums. It is expendable. It is transferable. We are often in the way when it comes to development and urban renewal in this city, and unfortunately it is still happening today. So I love Black geographers because they make that connection. Like, we are not necessarily fixed to land, but we are integral to land, to the building of this nation and the foundation that we all are sitting upon, walking around in. So I'm getting on my soapbox, so let me wind it back a little bit. So there's geography and the unique nature that we have. And I think through counter mapping, which is a way of using maps in an alternative way to give alternative narratives, I find that I want to use maps, use these tools that were used to erase and to displace us, and kind of put us back on the map if possible. That is my one contribution that I hopefully am making during this research project. So the methods that I used included archival research. I love digging into the archives, mapping, of course, and looking at old maps and comparing geographies and the way that topography changed over time. If any of you are like map nerds or enthusiasts, I would highly recommend checking out the Sanborn maps. Those are maps that show like the but the actual footprints of buildings and structures in just most cities. You can find this through the Library of Congress or the Library of Virginia, but it shows just the change of topography and geography over time, but you'll also find that there are structures that once existed, like in the 1930s and 1940s, that don't exist today. So I used that as my foundation and then just started doing more research. I also used census data to look up the people attached to or affiliated with those properties, and then started creating maps. And one other thing that I did that was a little bit different, because I'm usually like a loner, or like I like doing research on my own, but I found that I really needed to engage with a community. So I have like an informal committee of people that I will refer to, like my dad, my uncles, cousins, and other descendants that I've met like along the way. And so if I came across like a picture or an image of a building that no longer existed, it was very helpful just to share that with them. I have like a little Facebook group. Thanks, Anna, you inspired me with that as well. But so I would just like post something like, hey, this is at so-and-so Idlewood Avenue. Do any of you recognize this? And it just opened up like just these memories and the sharing of knowledge that I would not have gotten if I just relied like on the institutional record keepers that we have. So that was very helpful, and it helped to answer some questions. So some of my findings: consult the elders is one of the first lessons that I learned that I should have learned initially. I guess when I was researching the history of Weston Elementary School, I could not for the life of me, at least not going to the institutions, find any record of Black people at this school. I couldn't. And there are some wonderful digital collections and databases, but I was just like getting a little hopeless. And then I started talking to my uncle, and he shared this picture with me. So he's in the bottom row, the fifth from the right. But anyway, my Uncle Walker, he attended Weston Elementary School, not necessarily at its final location, but when it was at where the Randolph School is, if anyone recognizes that. So anyway, but he had this in his own personal collection. I had no idea. I didn't realize that he had attended that school. I thought that he was older and assumed that he had gone somewhere else. But anyway, he shared this with me, and I mean, this is like I would not have found this in any other place. So I'm very grateful for that. So I found that, and that was wonderful. And he also talked to me about, and through his memories, like I learned more about just where people were situated, and like he had to walk 8 blocks to get to school when he lived right next to where an all-white school was. The all-white school that was referred in those redlining comments, that was the school. He couldn't go there. He had to go somewhere else in order to attend school. So that was interesting as well, and just like a very painful part of history that I think more of us need to be aware of, because there are people living today who remember that, who have those memories. I also noticed these local diasporas within the city. So say for my own family, the Bowers, they lived on the 1400 block of Idlewood Avenue. They were displaced when the expressway was being built, so that was in the 1950s. They were moved to the 2200 block of Idlewood, was displaced again during the 1960s when the expressway was being expanded. And then later on, they were in that red line area. They were displaced from their home once more in the 1970s. My great-grandparents were pushed into public housing, and the place where their home used to exist today is still vacant. It was supposed to be used for a playground, but that never panned out. And so that was just one of many stories that I'm finding of like families just being moved around in this city because they were restricted. They were limited as far as where they could be or live and exist. And just seeing that that's still playing out today, I cannot emphasize that enough, is maddening. But I think that the more of us who know this history and talk about it, like hopefully we can change some of that. Some of the names that I recognized in my research included Senator Henry Marsh. I located in the census where his home used to exist on South Addison Street. It no longer exists. There's a highway going through it. The celebrated columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Michael Paul Williams, is an alum of West End Elementary School. So it would be really cool if I could interview him one day just to find out about his experience. So there's just this very rich history. And as Sonia pointed out, like, I feel like I'm just at like the cusp of this. Like, I think that this could be enough to argue like for a cultural landscape or nomination or something. So yes, I'm getting... Yes. And so some of the deliverables, because I am like an overachiever, that I've come up with so far include a story map about the Black West End. I can make that public. It's a work in progress, but it helps to catalog the pictures and the maps and all the research that I've done so far. I've created a virtual guided tour of the Black West End. Again, a work in progress, but what I have done is integrated pictures of sites that exist today and as well as sites that no longer exist. So people can take like the location, use the app, and just see what existed in the space before. And I hope that that creates like a good argument for why cultural landscapes matter as well. And finally, I'm most proud of this, and this again is a work in progress, but a community family tree. I'm inspired by just like family trees are a way that we find out our history, but what about the family trees or the communities within a space? So this will be a searchable database. You can look up a street name or a surname and be able to locate at least the people who live in certain houses at a certain time. And you'll find that, I think that we are often reduced to data points when it comes to maps. So actually, I want to put names back on the map. I want people to be recognized. When we talk about the massive displacement that's happening in Richmond, like it's not just numbers and units, it's people, it's families, it's households. Some of these households had more than like 10 people living in them. And so I think that if we really want to rectify and address the past, and we have to start naming people and recognizing that, there's this lineage of trauma that's been perpetuated and continuing today. And the more that we know, the more that we can actually name and say people's names and whatnot, then I think the better off we'll be. So thank you so much for being here. going to pass this on to Tim Roberts, who will be introducing Randall Hazard.
Thank you, LaToya. What a time. This is the best time to be alive. This is the best time. I'm having a really good time right now. I came up here and you're going to hit me with the 5 because you might as well do it right now because I don't work well off script and I'm going off script right now. Dr. Lee knows. And part of this is in honor of Randall. Randall is venturing into the unknown. And venturing into the unknown, one of the things that fascinates me about him, his reputation preceded him. And I had to reach out because people keep asking, how is it the guy that knows everybody and knows everything that's going on has never heard of Randall Hazard? And I thought he was like some old man, and reached out and was blown away by his accomplishment already in the project he was working on. I'm like, how have you done so much not knowing who I know? You don't know. And it wasn't just it was a labor of love, And a lot of these threads that are running through this plush fabric of this evening, time and connection, landscapes, place-based, spatial identity, the humanizing of these landscapes, where we're not taking these historic resources that our fellows are looking into and elevating and putting them on a dusty shelf. We're inhabiting these spaces. We're acknowledging that they're an ever-present part of our lived experience and reality. They're influencing us as much as they're a reflection of our past and how we got to where we are right now. Thank you so much for the urban renewal discussion because it hasn't stopped during the reception since, I guess what we talked about before, we talked about the hard stuff. We talked about urban renewal a little bit. And we can celebrate because next year is the 50th anniversary of the end of the federal urban renewal program. People don't think when they think of like reconstruction, it's just something that happens, that just goes on, when in fact this was a very organized, structured, legal, and defended, enforced, if you will, process with a very clear and blatant agenda. It's profound when you go back and you start reading some of the stuff from 60s, right, when they're coming out with urban renewal, the record and the controversy. We know there are problems. It's not really working out according to plan, but we have a plan. So there's an article that I just want to encourage everybody to read, and then I'm going to introduce you for real. I've been talking about this a lot by Mark Freed, written in 1963, Grieving for a Lost Home. And what this article discusses is the impact of the relocation experience on people, on families. It's a case study over 2 years in Boston where community is being displaced through urban renewal. The plan with urban renewal was to find the built-up blighted slums, which is purely subjective, because they're built up. They're built-up blighted areas. Okay, demolish them, straight up, demolish them and redevelop. That was the plan. It was 1, 2, 3. And we are seeing a lot today. Frankly, I think it's a bit more insidious. We can't speak so boldly. But what this article does is it describes how the expression of loss is tantamount to grief. It's the only thing that this loss of this community, this spatial identity, your home, can be compared to. And it's everlasting. It doesn't end. We deal with it. It affects how we engage with the world. We are now, our children are now experiencing this grieving parent. And so that trauma is then passed down. And as LaToya is discussing, this is not just a matter of we checked the box, we're out, we're now in a new community. There's the displacement, there's the demolition of this home. In some places like Westwood, here on the West End, since 1870, this community has been there. And over the years, 74 will be 50, so, we're getting close to the 150 mark there. 250. 150. We're seeing it happen there, and we should anticipate the grief that comes along with this loss. Something interesting about this article is that it was written in 63, and it says that this is an experience that is exclusive to the working class, to poor people. I don't know how you identify, if you identify as middle class, but would you experience this grief? Are you ready for this? Are you ready for this loss? As you said, they're not just numbers. These are people and places with feelings, and the impacts last forever. And what we see often with LaToya's family in the same community is the continual displacement of the same people. 2 generations perhaps pass when that feeling of loss is starting to deaden, when it's starting to calm down, And then here they are again with a voucher this time. Moving around the city, that's not going to be an option. That's not going to be an option anymore. You know, where's the reintegration? We're focused on, that was my own personal 5-minute mark. So I'll just say quickly, Randall and I communicated, we met, I was blown away by this project, and he told me he was inspired to start identifying these African-American nightlife entertainment spots after coming home from Norfolk State University, master's degree, it's deep COVID, having a lot of family time, and asking his father, there's the connections and the relationships. How did y'all meet? Where did you court? And he started, my dad would have done this, dragged him around to all these spots. This is here, this used to be here, this happened here, and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, I'm funding a project through DHR that's focused on Green Book listed establishments, specifically there in the Middle Peninsula. We connect, the timing couldn't have been better. Randall Hazard introduces me to his aunt, Marion Randall, who steps up and is giving these oral histories and supporting the program. And it's that kind of connection, it's those kinds of relationships, I think, that are really speaking to the relevance of the work that we do. This is a history in living color, Dolby audio, digital surround sound. You know, when we're talking about what happened 50 years ago during urban renewal, we can look back with that 20/20 hindsight and say, we saw what happened then with these same processes. Are we barreling towards the same outcome? I think we are, but I think it's these scholars and these people here in this cohort, these fellows, and through this program, that we're ready to make a stand. The time is now. It ends now. I'll turn it over to Randall.
Like my mentor, I'll probably be going over time, so I'll let you know now. All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for having me. Also thank you to Preservation Virginia and everyone else involved in supporting my research around community archives and other preservation efforts. So my main argument for this evening is that the model of community archives and its partnership with community-driven archival practices are proven solutions to addressing many of the gaps within historical records and associated archival absences. The model is effective because it builds the capacity for historical preservation in the communities that know these histories most intimately, will have a direct investment in their preservation for the continuation of their own historical lineages and identities. We'll investigate this claim through 3 points or sections. 1, history's hidden in plain sight, where I'll discuss my personal journey in becoming aware of the need for community archives. 2, supplemental infrastructure, where we'll examine the impact of 3 currently existing ComArc initiatives. And then finally, we'll end with futures for all to see, where I'll discuss what I believe is the next phase for testing the spaces. Here are my sources for this particular presentation, but as Professor Wynne Bryan can attest to from the multiple articles I've been emailing her with fellowship period, there are countless studies on this topic. So on the importance of historical preservation, I believe that without an institutional passage of what came before, each new generation begins again, divorced from the collective wealth of their forebears. Instead of extending onto an ancestral continuum, their inheritance is scattered into the wind, lost adrift in a massive sea. They navigate through unmarked terrain as past relics go unrecognized, deprived of a sense of people, culture, or history. And that was the jeopardy I found myself in as I grew up surrounded by histories hidden in plain sight. So I grew up in Gloucester, a rural town in the Tidewater area of Virginia that I believe for most of my life had nothing really going on and likely never did. No one had ever heard of it when they asked where I was from, and I jokingly responded to them that it was a cornfield beside more recognized locations like Jamestown or Richmond. But throughout my childhood, I would overhear stories from community elders of days gone by, and I became aware that there was once far more happening in the cornfield than I had previously imagined. Through these oral histories, I was able to begin documenting the history of Gloucester's black nightlife venues. I was able to capture the names of 50-plus long-gone locations like the restaurants, clubs, and theaters my parents frequented when they were first dating. Some were tied to the larger historical context of the Chitlin Circuit, and some were even listed in the Traveler's Green Book, yet others, affectionately known as shot houses, were not even registered as official businesses within the county. These locations were part of the local economy and society and just as frequented as the formal businesses. However, because of their illegitimate status, there are few traces of their existence in the historical record outside of the living memory of their former patrons. Suddenly, many of the abandoned buildings I passed by daily were now enriched with historical context. For the most part, none of this information was something you could just Google. Most of it came from word of mouth, private photos, and newspaper collections, and members of the descendant community getting in their cars and taking me directly to the venue sites. And through these collaborations and working with a local preservation organization, the Fairfield Foundation, we were able to document the site locations for 23 of the nightlife venues. We also created Beacrest records for these sites, as well as a host of churches and graveyards associated with the community. And then also during this fellowship period, I joined the initiative at UNC Chapel Hill called Archivist in a Backpack, which I'll explain a little bit more in just a bit. So here, there was a photo of the wagon wheel from during its heyday. So let me go into explaining what the wagon wheel is. Now, to highlight a few of the more well-known locations on our list of nightlife venues and their impact on the surrounding communities, it's hard to top the wagon wheel. And we also have with us today a member of the descendant community of this organization, and Mrs. Cleo Warren. I'd like to thank her for her support in my journey so far, and for many of the photos she's probably recognizing right now in the presentation. So the wagon wheel was a part of a host of businesses surrounding the Black community of Gloucester, run by Leon and George Gregory and Gregory Catlett, and of course their supporting families. Alongside the wagon wheel, there was the Hub Cleaners, Rim Theater, Tidewater Wheels baseball team, and Hubcaps softball team. As a stop on the historic network of Black performance halls known as the Chitlin Circuit, the wagon wheel was known far and wide as a place to see pop icons such as Ike and Tina Turner, James Brown, Otis Redding, Willie Mays, and many more. Alongside the entertainment value it brought the community, they were also known to host charity events where the ticket sales would be donated to local families in need. And going back to the Tidewater Wheels baseball team, I have here a photo of my grandfather, Clyde T. Randall, circled in red alongside his teammates. Next is the site listed in the Traveler's Green Book, known as Stokes' Tavern. Also pictured here is the owner, Waldron Geronimo Stokes himself. Although in need of repair now, this venue operated arguably as the headquarters for most leisure activity for a generation of Black Gloucester. Hopefully my parents don't mind me saying this, but they met here. And without this place, I may not be here standing before you now. So it makes it historically relevant in my book. And now to deviate a little bit from Black nightlife, I also want to share what I believe may be the crown jewel of Black history in Gloucester County, which is the Moden Conference Center at Howard Hall. From what I've uncovered so far, this history begins largely with the work of Booker T. Washington during his time at Hampton University, formerly known as Hampton Institute. In pursuit of this goal of social upliftment through education of the African population, many connections to Gloucester were formed. Standing next to him on the slide is Robert Russell Moden and Moden's son-in-law, Frederick Douglass Patterson. On top of these men being the founders and first three presidents of what became Tuskegee University, they also used their relative wealth and status to create a haven or incubator for larger social justice movements of the time period. In the confines of Moden's retirement home in Gloucester, they would invite Black political icons such as W.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King to strategize on how to make their impacts on the larger country and world. And two natives that supported that mission were Matthew T. Driver and Thomas Calhoun Walker. Matthew Driver, pictured here in the red circle next to Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver, is my great-great-uncle and was a member of the Tuskegee Executive Council. So as far as I was aware, this was not common knowledge in my family, so you can imagine how surprised to find a relative so close to some of the most revered names in Black history. Then with T.C. Walker, he was part of the Black student recruitment efforts at Hampton Institute after abolition. While there, he was advertised as a model student, a shining example of what education can do in the effort towards African upliftment. In the book Uplift Cinema, by author Allison Fields, she documents one of the heavily circulated Hampton Institute advertisements about him in Gloucester. It states, Thomas C. Walker, a lawyer who helped black residents of Gloucester County, Virginia, to build homes and buy land, leading to the improvements of churches and schools. As a result, the migration to northern cities was stopped. For a space of 5 years, no Negro was sent from the county to the penitentiary. T.C. Walker would continue his work building schools and other community institutions throughout Gloucester for the rest of his life. So these are just a few of the stories I found that surely put to rest the idea that Gloucester only had a few cornfields. But this is certainly only a tiny fraction of uncovered history. And knowing that is what started me on my journey in researching methods for historical preservation and education. And through that research, I became convinced that the traditional archive process would need to be supplemented. Institutional archives and universities with large endowments will require a more community-centered companion. And I think this reality is best captured by Shadra Powell, archivist and university libraries curator of the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She states that typically, when a community's historical materials encounter a large academic library's archive, the engagement is transactional. They sign forms, they hand over their archives, and the traditional archive assures them that their materials will be valued by researchers. These procedures make assumptions about comfort with gift agreements. What if the community seeks compensation or value ascribed to academic researchers? What about other kinds of information seekers? These approaches may work for communities who have only been extolled and affirmed by the formal archive, but other communities need a different approach. They argue that community archives are strengthened with the strategic support of institutions, and institutional aspirations thrive with the inclusion of community voices and practices. Practicing what they call community-driven archives, or centering the needs of the community over the needs of their traditional institution, allows them to consider their work with deference to marginalized communities. They accept that each community's relationship to an institutional repository is different. They believe strongly in the need to imagine archive collections as a constellation of custodians and locations. Librarians and researchers are resourceful enough to consider access and stewardship of collections beyond the traditional extractive model. In addition to avoiding problematic attitudes like degrading a community's capacity for managing their own collections or dismissing a community's preference surrounding the fate of their materials, traditionally held by some librarians and archival professionals, one important reason to advocate for post-custodial avenues for historical materials is that archival collections are bound to be understood differently when they are surrounded by similar collections as opposed to being a special initiative in a larger repository. This is the thinking behind their recent program pictured here, Archivists in a Backpack. Through the support of the Mellon Foundation grant, the goal of Archivists in a Backpack is simple. Marginalized communities often need tools and resources to help them document their personal, family, local, and regional histories. Their team provides a starter kit along with hands-on support and training. Through their training programs and community-focused work, they've been able to support multiple community institutions throughout the South, Gloucester soon to be one of them. And here we have a digital example. The South Asian American Digital Archive offers another approach in the documenting of underrepresented groups. SADA, as they are called, preserves and makes accessible the history of the more than 4.3 million individuals in the U.S. who traces their heritage to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the many South Asian diasporic communities across the globe. They have slowly grown SADA from an organization that had an annual operating budget of $300 a decade ago, consisting of their own founding donations, to one that has an operating budget of approximately $100,000 each year for the last 3 years. They have also maintained a paid full-time staff member and multiple part-time staff members for the last 5 years. They did this by, over the last 5 years, 927 individual donors that made 3,232 donations of $73.84 on average to the organization, contributing more than $250,000 of support. Later in the development, they were able to begin receiving grants from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage and the National Endowment for the Humanities. They are also post-custodial a post-custodial archive, which means that rather than accepting physical custody of materials, they borrow them from the individuals, families, organizations, and other archival repositories, digitize them, describe the materials using culturally appropriate terminology, make them freely accessible online, and then return the originals. And here are some of the highlights of the work over the past few years. And then lastly, we have the Shorefront Legacy Center. The early work of Shorefront begins in 1995 as an interest group known as Through the Eyes of Us in an attempt to capture and record the early black communities on Chicago's suburban North Shore. The initiative grew out of the home of the founder, pictured here, Dino Robinson. The early work focused on gathering oral histories, researching historic names, businesses, organizations, and migration patterns. In 1999, after 2 publications on the local black community, the group introduced the quarterly Shorefront Journal, a contributed collection of historical information. From there, the efforts grew in organizing and officially became known as Shorefront in 2002. Shorefront has since expanded its work to include youth programming, exhibits, public presentations, and building an archive representing the historic black communities north of Chicago. Currently, the collection consists of over 500 linear feet of documents, photographs, moving images, and other related artifacts. The Shorefront Legacy Center has been widely used as a resource to the benefit of historical and educational institutions, students in the community, and other historians. Since 2010, Shorefront has worked closely with the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, assisting them in becoming a model community-based archive. I find this bridge between academic departments and the community very interesting. Many departments often carry out research within the local community, but often do not share that research with the members of the community, even at times the research subjects. So I see this as a way of expanding educational opportunities and universities' community engagement. So these community archive initiatives are clear examples of how histories that were otherwise hidden from mainstream institutions can be preserved and shared for years to come. And I believe they offer a blueprint or futures for all to see. So my thinking now for the road ahead is that most of these various projects mapped out their own development in isolation. But what if there was an overarching organization that could compile all the various strategies that were used and provide some guidance for up-and-coming historical groups to ensure that their research, they would reach their preservation objectives. And I think the first step in testing this hypothesis is to develop an instructional video course inspired largely by the training program of Archivists in a Backpack on not only how to develop your individual skill set of conducting oral history interviews or scanning historical documents and photos, but providing a step-by-step roadmap on how to grow your personal passion for your community history into a community endeavor, from a digital archive in the vein of SADA to eventually a physical structure in the heart of your community like Shorefront. As users complete the course, they can test out their skill development through in-person events that help to grow the capacity for the overall project. And they can also proudly share news of their newly attained skills through digital badges that track their development, and if they choose to, they can participate in other preservation projects through the local network the overarching structure would develop. So to summarize, I believe that there are strength in numbers, and I intend to grow these numbers substantially. And through these community preservation networks, these hidden histories will be found, preserved, and shared for years to come. I'd like to end with this photo because I feel it captures perfectly the concept of an ancestral cultural continuum that preservation work provides. We can expand and transform our identities by simply embracing these stories of old. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Dr. Brian Brown if he would come and close us out, and we have something special we'd like to do. He is the chair, he's a member of the board at Preservation Virginia, and also will be chairing a newly formed committee where our mentors derive from what we've affectionately called the working group. And he can tell you more about it, but he's going to be chairing that committee, so I'm going to ask him to come.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, wasn't it? That was history class. So thank you, Lisa, so much. And I also want to take a moment to thank Elizabeth Kostelny, Jenny Keller, for creating this. This was your vision. Your vision has come to fruition. And I also want to thank Preservation Virginia briefly for creating this, right? For creating this. And if you haven't noticed, this isn't your grandparents' Preservation Virginia. This is a different preservation. And we should be happy about that. I'm thrilled to be a part of the African American Fellowship Program. I'm thrilled to be the first presenter of the African American Preservationist pinning ceremony for this historical inaugural cohort. I'd like to ask the mentors to please come forward and pin our preservationists, our new preservationists. And while you are pinning, I'm going to read an abbreviated version of a resolution for each mentee and fellow. For Sonia Branch Wilson, again, currently serving as the president of AMD Pine Grove Project. Her project, Funeral Programs, the biography of a black community from the 1920s to 1960s, is helping to build a stronger narrative of the people who shaped the Pine Grove community. LaToya Gray Parks, recent grad of the Wilder School at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her project focused again on the Randolph community, the historically black neighborhood in West End of Richmond that was impacted by the pressures of urban planning and development. And again, Randall Hazard, he has, as you know and learned, a deep personal interest in researching, saving, and preserving the buildings and stories of historic African-American nightlife venues in Gloucester County, including the W.J. Stokes Tavern. His project ties together institutional archives with the oral traditions of grassroots historians in the black community to develop a dynamic history of the venues on the Chitlin Circuit, listings in the Traveler's Green Book and other informal businesses that were a key part of the local economy. Look at that. Look at that. Be it resolved that the Board of Trustees of Preservation Virginia recognizes Sonia Branch Wilson, LaToya Gray Sparks, and Randall Hazard for their commitment to research that helps to tell the complex and full story of Virginia's history, and for their dedication and participation in the first class of Preservation Virginia African American Fellows. Congratulations to our first cohort of African American preservationists. We look forward to our very long fellowship and partnership. I will now ask Elizabeth Kostelny to offer her closing remarks.
Thank you, Brian. I don't know how to follow that up, other than to say we're thrilled that this program has come to reality. We couldn't have asked for a better group of fellows the first year. But as I looked around today, I thought this is the responsibility of all of us. So many of you in the room inspired this through our work together over the decades. And so many of us have to look forward to the results that this is just a small piece of. So promise me that next year, about this time, you'll come back for the next group of fellows, and we'll keep multiplying and adding to the world of historic preservation and make sure that it tells the true history of this country and all of its narratives. So thank you for being here tonight, and congratulations again to my